Welcome, this is one of the most frequently seen opening setups you'll come across in your games. The 4 Knights variation. In today's video, I'm going to introduce you to a really tricky and exciting gambit you can play as white in this very opening. I've got plenty of incredible tricks and traps lined up for you. At first glance, this may look like a boring, symmetrical position, but chess isn't meant to be dull. Let's shake things up with the bold move, knight takes on e5. This is the Halloween Gambit. Now, hold on, I know you're worried about just giving away your knight for nothing. But trust me, this is actually a fantastic opening, especially in faster time controls. In fact, the stats back it up. Take a look. White actually has the highest win percentage after playing knight takes on e5, outperforming typical moves like bishop to c4 or d3. So, what happens when black captures your knight? As I mentioned, we'll gain tempo by launching attacks on black's knights. Starting with d4, black now has 2 main responses. Moving the knight to c6 or g6. Moving to g4 doesn't make sense, as e5 creates a double attack, forcing black to lose one of their knights. In this position, black will want to maintain the material advantage, which is why they'll typically retreat to either c6 or g6. Let's first examine the move knight to c6. Here, we respond with d5, putting pressure on the knight once again. Black has a few escape options, but knight to e7 isn't the best choice. After a few more pawn moves, we keep chasing black's knight, and eventually, after queen to e2 check, black is forced to sacrifice either the bishop or the knight. So, knight to e7 isn't a reliable move for black. This leaves them with 2 main options. Let's look at the most common move, which is knight to e5. Now, you respond with an attack using the f-pawn. The best black can do is retreat the knight to g6, but now we start threatening black's other knight. Notice how effectively we're pushing black back and gaining control of the center. This is all about central pawn play in the Halloween Gambit, so keep that in mind. Black's knight will end up underdeveloped. Even if black tries to pin with the queen, you can counter it. And eventually, they'll have to retreat the knight. After e5, most players will simply fall back, which gives you an opening to push even further. Capture on c6, and look at that pawn. It's completely restricting black's position. If black tries a standard development move like knight to f6, you have a check, and black ends up losing material. This is why black will be forced to create space for the king, just to avoid the danger of the check. So the 2 most common responses you will see are queen b6 and queen f6. If queen b6, we'll get our knight closer, eyeing down this c7 fork, and we are also adding another defender to this pawn. Look, this knight b5 move is going to be a common theme in many variations. So just keep that in mind. Okay, now black has to prevent the fork, so king d8 seems the most logical response, and we just continue attacking with our pawns. By the way, if he moves to h4, then the knight is gone. The most popular response is knight e5, and again, just develop with tempo. Don't give him time to even think of an attack. Most probably, he will try to defend with f6. You can just move your queen, stay connected to this pawn, and look to castle. Now, if he tries something like a6, trying to push back the knight and grab this pawn, you have the bishop going after the queen, and after the queen moves, black is in trouble because queen a5 check, then knight c7 check, and the rook is gone. Even though you lose the pawn, it's still a great game to play as white. You can bring out the knight, castle on the queenside, and black is still struggling with the vulnerable king. While all these pieces are just chilling on the back rank. Okay, let's go back. So this is how you can play against queen b6. Now, what if he goes for queen f6? He's applying pressure on both these pawns, so playing knight b5 straight away can be a little risky because there is this variation where, if he finds this brilliant move, knight f4, then you might land in trouble. Even though you manage to pick up the rook, your king is exposed, and black can take advantage with his queen and knight. He can bring in his bishops as well, which can be quite uncomfortable to deal with. Therefore, in this position, when the queen comes to f6, I would suggest you begin with a check. And after he blocks, then you can continue with your plan of knight b5. Even if he exchanges the queens, you still have this double attack, so he has to move the king. And now you can target this pawn with bishop e3. If he plays b6, you can castle on the kingside, control this file with your rook, keep pushing the pawns, and of course, you still have this really strong pawn, which is always going to suffocate black. By the way, instead of moving this pawn, there are high chances that your opponent might go for a6. He's trying to push back this knight so that he can pick up this pawn, but then you can completely destroy him with one check after another. Eventually, you pick up the rook and just keep moving back and forth, picking up these pawns, and you should be easily winning it from here. It's such a great feeling to smash your opponent like this. In fact, there's one more thing that makes me even happier. Okay, now let's go back. After d5, we just looked at all the options after black plays knight e5, but what if he goes back to b8? Well, our plan remains the same. Just go after the knight, push him back, advance further. Exchange the pawns and just tie him down with this pawn. If he tries to make space for the king again, knight b5 is the key move. And here, if he tries something like knight a6, that's a terrible square for the knight. You can develop this bishop, then bring out the other one, and it starts getting really uncomfortable for black. Black is paralyzed. He can't move any of these pieces. On the other hand, you can simply castle and launch an attack with your entire army. The engine gives white almost a 5-point advantage in this position. That's the power of the Halloween Gambit. So, e4 e5, knight f3, knight c6, we arrive at the 4 knights opening. Now, in the Halloween Gambit, we sacrifice the knight and then continue the attack with d4. Earlier, we looked at all the main lines where black's knight moves to c6, now let's explore some ideas when it goes to g6. We begin with e5, harassing the knight. It can't go here because of our knight, and we also have the queen covering these 2 squares. So retreating is black's only option. Here, the engine recommends developing with bishop c4, but my preferred move is queen to f3, as it can really surprise your opponent. The most common response you'll see is d6, and now you can bring out the bishop, putting pressure on the f7 square. If black tries to defend with the queen, you can proceed normally and build pressure with all your pieces. Instead of the queen, however, you'll often find players opting for bishop e6, offering an exchange. But you have a clever line here. First, capture this pawn. If black takes your bishop, don't worry, we have a sneaky queen check, allowing you to reclaim the bishop as well. And if black tries to be greedy and picks up these pawns, then he's in serious trouble, as we can play queen e4, pinning the knight. Black is in deep trouble. Even if he tries to defend, we have f4. And eventually, the knight will be lost. After you play queen f3, d6 is the most popular response, as we saw earlier. Another common move from black is developing the bishop and pinning the knight. In this case, you'll play bishop c4 as usual, targeting f7. Queen e7 is a common response from black, allowing you to castle. Black might exchange the bishop for the knight. But now look at this pawn structure. All our pieces are poised to jump into action, and we control all the central squares. It's really difficult to play as black here. Just look at those pieces. They're absolutely redundant and won't be doing much for at least a few moves. After examining all these lines, the big question is, how do you counter this intimidating opening when you're playing as black? Well, after d4, the knight has 2 possible retreats, but I highly recommend going back to g6. As knight c6 gives white exactly what they want. Just count the number of tempos white gains. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep practicing. Stay sharp, and as always, happy checkmating.